Millions of years ago, Earth's oceans were nothing like the oceans we know today. There were no humans, no whales like the ones we see today. And the oceans weren't divided into separate bodies like the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans. Instead, much of the planet's water was connected as one enormous ocean system. And within that vast underwater world, giant marine reptiles ruled as some of the top predators. But the giant predators weren't the strangest part of the ancient ocean. Far below the surface was a world that sunlight could barely reach. The deeper you went, the greater the pressure became, the colder the water got, and the harder it was to find food. And yet, life was still there. Even when a giant marine reptile died and its body sank to the ocean floor, its death could actually become the beginning of life for countless other organisms. So what was the underwater world really like when dinosaurs still ruled the Earth? To find out, we have to travel back between about 252 and 66 million years ago to a period known as the Mesozoic Era. Back then, the planet looked very different. Today, we think of the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans as separate oceans divided by continents. But millions of years ago, the arrangement of land and water was completely different. Much of the world's water was connected, and stretching across much of this ancient planet was a gigantic ocean known as Panthalassa. In another part of the ancient world was the Tethys Sea, stretching between enormous land masses that would eventually become parts of the continents we know today. Sea levels were also much higher than they are in many parts of the world today. Places that are now dry land were once covered by shallow seas, and those shallow seas became incredibly productive environments for marine life. But before these ecosystems could flourish, Earth went through one of the greatest mass extinctions in its history. Around 252 million years ago, the Permian-Triassic extinction wiped out most marine species and many species on land. Life was devastated. But it didn't stay that way forever. Life slowly recovered. On land, dinosaurs began to rise. In the oceans, another group of animals took over. Giant marine reptiles. There were mosasaurs, including the famous Mosasaurus. There were plesiosaurs, with 4 large flippers and body shapes unlike almost anything alive today. And there were pliosaurs, powerful predators with massive heads and strong jaws. At first glance, they might look like dinosaurs that simply moved into the water. But they weren't dinosaurs. They were reptiles that evolved separately for life in the ocean. And despite being powerful marine predators, they had one major limitation. They had to breathe air. They didn't have gills like fish. They had lungs. That meant they could dive and stay underwater for long periods, but eventually they had to return to the surface to breathe. Even the largest predators in the ancient ocean were still tied to the surface by biology, but the surface was only one small part of their world. During the Mesozoic era, Earth was generally warmer than it is today. The polar regions didn't have the massive ice sheets we know today, and sea levels could rise much higher. That meant huge areas of land were covered by shallow water. And these shallow seas became hotspots for marine life. Coral reefs spread across large areas. Ammonites, with their spiral shells, became some of the most recognizable creatures in the ancient ocean. Cephalopods also became highly successful. Their bodies were flexible, and their lack of bones allowed them to move through spaces that many other animals couldn't reach. Some of their relatives also developed impressive abilities to change color and blend into their surroundings. The shallow ocean was full of activity. There were predators. There was prey, and countless species were connected through complex food webs. But the deeper you went, the more everything changed. Light began to disappear. The temperature dropped, pressure increased, and food became harder and harder to find. At certain depths, almost no sunlight could reach the water. There were no plants getting energy from the sun, so how could anything survive down there? The answer is surprisingly simple. Death. When a large marine animal died, its body eventually sank toward the seafloor. Today, we know this process as a whale fall. When a whale sinks to the bottom of the ocean, its body can provide food and shelter for an entire community of organisms. But this kind of ecosystem may have existed long before whales ever appeared. When a giant marine reptile died, its body could also sink into the deep ocean. And once it reached the seafloor, that body didn't simply become a pile of remains. It could become the center of a new ecosystem. Different organisms could feed on it, and even the bones could become a source of nutrients and habitat. Scientists have found fascinating clues in the fossils of ancient plesiosaurs. Some fossil bones show patterns of damage that resemble the activity seen on the bones of modern whales. One of the most unusual organisms involved is Osedax, sometimes called the zombie worm. These tiny creatures have root-like structures that penetrate bones and allow them to access nutrients inside. Using techniques such as CT scanning, scientists have even been able to identify these structures in fossil material. This suggests that ecosystems built around the remains of large animals may have existed millions of years before modern whales appeared. So the deep ocean wasn't an empty wasteland. Life was still happening down there. The difference was where the energy came from. Instead of relying directly on sunlight, deep-sea organisms could depend on organic material falling down from the waters above. And the deeper you went, the more extreme the environment became. Pressure increased dramatically. Light almost disappeared completely. And food became incredibly scarce. Animals living in these conditions needed specialized adaptations. One of the best examples was the ichthyosaur. These marine reptiles lived from the Triassic period through the Cretaceous and evolved into many different species. But their earliest ancestors didn't look anything like dolphins. Early ichthyosaurs still had bodies that looked somewhat like lizards. Over millions of years, however, their bodies changed dramatically. They became more streamlined, their fins became more specialized, and eventually some species developed body shapes remarkably similar to modern dolphins. This is an example of convergent evolution. Different groups of animals can evolve similar body shapes when they face similar environmental challenges. But one of the most fascinating features of some ichthyosaurs was their eyes. Ophthalmosaurus, for example, had enormous eyes. They may have reached around 25 centimeters, or roughly 10 inches, across. For comparison, a modern blue whale's eye is only around 11 centimeters, or about 4 inches. So why did these animals need such huge eyes? Because when you live in a world with very little light, every bit of available light matters. Large eyes could have helped them detect movement and spot prey in low-light conditions. Scientists have also found evidence of the pigment eumelanin in ichthyosaur fossils. This provides clues about what their bodies may have looked like. They likely had darker coloration on top and lighter coloration underneath. From underneath, a lighter belly could have made them harder to see against the brighter water near the surface. It was a simple but effective form of camouflage. All of this suggests that ichthyosaurs weren't simply large reptiles swimming through the ocean. Their bodies were highly adapted for life in the water. But even these highly specialized predators had limits. One of those limits was pressure. The deeper an animal dives, the more pressure its body has to deal with. Some studies of fossil evidence have even suggested signs that may be connected to decompression-related problems. If pressure changes too quickly, gases dissolved in the body can form bubbles and damage tissues. In other words, even the most powerful predators of the ancient ocean couldn't escape the laws of physics. They could dive, they could chase prey, but they still had limits. Then there were the plesiosaurs. These animals had 4 large flippers that they used to move through the water. Unlike fish, which mainly rely on their tails for propulsion, plesiosaurs used their flippers to generate movement and control their direction. Their swimming style made them look almost like they were flying underwater. That kind of control could have been extremely useful while hunting, especially in environments where visibility was limited. Some marine reptiles also appear to have adapted to colder and deeper waters. Being able to move vertically through the water column would have been a major advantage, because food wasn't always found at the same depth. Sometimes it was near the surface, sometimes it was much deeper. An animal capable of moving between these layers could follow its food wherever it went. And when we put all of these examples together, we start to see a pattern. Every environment created its own challenges, and every animal had to find a way to survive. Some relied on size, some relied on speed, some developed enormous eyes. Some evolved streamlined bodies. Others developed specialized ways of moving through the water, and some of the smallest organisms survived by feeding on the remains of enormous predators. That's what makes the ancient ocean so fascinating. Extreme environments didn't necessarily stop life. Sometimes they pushed life to become even more specialized. When we look at the ocean today, we mostly see the surface: blue water, waves, sunlight. But most of the ocean exists far below what we can see. And millions of years ago, that hidden world was even stranger. While the ancient oceans formed a vast interconnected system, giant marine reptiles moved through waters surrounding continents that looked nothing like the ones on today's map. Near the surface, life flourished under the sunlight. Far below, life survived in darkness, and when giant predators died, their bodies could become new sources of life on the seafloor. But eventually, that world changed. Continents continued to move, oceans changed, marine reptiles disappeared, and around 66 million years ago, non-avian dinosaurs and many other groups were wiped out in a mass extinction. Their world was gone, but traces of it remained. In bones, teeth, shells, and fossils buried in rock for millions of years. From these fragments, scientists have slowly reconstructed a picture of a world that disappeared long ago. And perhaps the most fascinating part is that we still don't know the whole story. Even today, huge parts of the ocean remain difficult for humans to explore. And the ancient seafloor has been hiding its secrets for tens or even hundreds of millions of years. So when you imagine the ocean during the age of dinosaurs, don't just picture a Mosasaurus chasing its prey. Picture an entire world. Above, sunlight filtering through the water. In the middle depths, countless creatures searching for food. And far below, in almost complete darkness, life continuing in ways we can barely imagine. That world is gone. But the fossils we discover today prove that the ancient ocean was one of the most extreme and biologically diverse environments in Earth's history. And the deeper we look into the past, the more we realize something. The ocean we know today may only be a small part of the much bigger story of life on our planet.